how do you take these organizations to scale? And we need to recast both how we fund things through government and the private sector. And it's great. Jeff mentioned it's great. There's the Social Innovation Fund. There's the Invest in Innovation Fund at the Department of Education. But they're very small compared to the overall budget and the overall need. Every department should have an equivalent of a What Works fund. So the government, with matching funds from private philanthropy, can help take these things to scale. We need to think about a different kind of media for the nonprofit sector. We have a business page. Why not have a civil society page? A section where we can cover these things. We can learn both about successes and the mistakes. Arianna Huffington has long proposed that we should have C-SPAN 4. You know, there's C-SPAN 1, 2, and 3 that covers the government and public policy and books. Why not have C-SPAN 4 that's covering the social sector? I mean, I know from working in this sector, I'm sure you know, there's so many good things that happen, you can't get any attention on it. You know? So we need that. We need to think about how we attract, I mean, with this Bridgespan study, how do we attract the best and brightest to our sector? You know, how do we have the equivalent of MBAs? How do we have more nonprofit degree programs, more courses in nonprofit management? How do we build that talent pool and that bench? And so that if you are a young person and you want to get into this sector, you don't have to do it by scratch. You can actually go get a degree and get that training, and you come out of it feeling, you know, terrific because you've got that experience. And we need to reward people through AmeriCorps scholarships, through loan forgiveness, through special fellowships, so that if you go to the nonprofit sector, you don't have to take a vow of poverty for your whole life. We have to stop the sort of second-class nature of our sector. You know, and this feeling that if you join the nonprofit sector, well, then you just have to sort of be second-class, or you've got to make that ongoing sacrifice. So we've got to make it so that people can actually do this for a living and pursue the American dream. So I think there's a number of things we could do to build this ecosystem, but we've got to think about it. These are just some of the ideas. You all will have your own ideas, and I encourage you to think about this, but we've got to seize this moment in terms of what's going on, both the needs and the times. There's a revolution that's been happening with the citizen sector. I felt it 15 years ago when I traveled the world. You can see it in our country every day. Things are changing, but we have to accelerate it. The needs are there. And so I encourage you to be advocates. Think about it. How do we be advocates for both changes within our own field and with public policy? And finally, I think the other thing we need to do if we're going to reach our potential is we have to recapture our sense that we're all in this together. We have to recapture our sense of common purpose. And it's often the nonprofit sector that really does provide that meeting place to build common ground. And we need this desperately in our country today, you know, where things are so divided. You know, and so what do I mean by that? Well, you know, if you think back to how this country got started, our Constitution does not begin with the words, I, a member of the United States, in order to get more for me. You know? No, it begins with those three beautiful, simple, at the time, very radical words. We the people. When those words were written by our founders, every other country in the world was governed by a king, a queen, a dictator, a shah. It was a radical idea that we the people would be in charge. And what's our mission statement as a country? In order to form a more perfect union. And one of the reasons I believe so much in this sector and the need to revitalize it and continue to enhance it is that if you think about our history, it's always been citizens who've driven that change towards a more perfect union. It was the citizen soldiers right here in Massachusetts who put down their pitchforks and picked up their muskets and said, we're going to take on the greatest empire of the day. It was the abolitionists, again, with leadership here in Massachusetts, that said slavery was morally wrong and had to end, that inspired Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. It was the suffragettes, and again, the first Women's Rights Convention was held here in Massachusetts. It was the suffragists who spent 75 years organizing and agitating and advocating and demanding that something, of course, we take for granted today, that women should be treated with full equality and have the right to vote. It was the greatest generation of our grandparents and great-grandparents, who we still revere 4 generations later, because they collectively worked to survive the Depression and then take on Hitler and the Nazis and prevail in World War II. It was the civil rights activists, the people who did the marches and the freedom rides and the sit-ins and the voter registration drives, that inspired President Kennedy after the March on Washington to be the first president to say this is a moral issue, and then made it possible for the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act to happen. And it's tens of thousands of people in Egypt right now as we meet who are saying enough with 30 years of a corrupt dictatorship. We want our rights, we want our freedoms, we want to come into the modern world. it's always been citizens, often using resources from our sector that have driven change. Now, we're not all going to be, or can be, Martin Luther Kings or Mother Teresas. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is how can each of us do our part? And it's the sum total of all those acts that's going to continue us on that journey to a more perfect union. And seeing you all here today, I just want to close with an old West African folk tale, because as I see you and so many old friends, I'm reminded of this. And it goes like this. It's called The Traveler. There was an old man who was sitting under a tree in the shade, reading a book, sort of enjoying the day. And by a traveler came along. And the traveler stopped and said, "Old man, I've been traveling across the countryside on a journey. Can you tell me what kind of people I'll find in your village?" And the older man looked up at him and he asked a simple question. He said, "What kind of people have you found on your travels?" And the traveler scoffed and he said, "Well, I've found people who lie, people who cheat, people who aren't kind to strangers, people who don't really care for one another." And the older man looked up at him and he just got a little bit of a sad look in his eyes and he said, "Those are the people you will find in my village." The traveler kind of kicked the dirt, stomped off into the village. Older man continued to enjoy the day reading his book, and by another traveler came along, stopped, and said, "Excuse me, kind sir, I've been traveling across the countryside. Can you tell me what kind of people I will find in your village?" And once again, the older man looked up at him and asked his simple question, "What kind of people have you found on your travels?" And the traveler said, "I found people who are kind, people who care for one another, people who welcome strangers, people who are good-hearted." And the older man looked up at him, and with a little bit of a smile on his eyes, he said, "Those are the people you will find in my village." Well, from 23 years ago, when I first walked into AGM with Michael, to today, I have been blessed to know people like you who've believed in dreams, who've supported people who want to do big things, who got behind young people with ideas, who through thick and thin do the hard work every day as big citizens. So it's a real honor and pleasure for me to be with you all here today. Thank you all very, very much.
So will you stay and answer some questions for us? We're going to do some Q&A now. So if we can, we have a couple of people with handheld microphones, yeah, Gail over here on my left, your right, and Jen over here. So if you want to raise your hand, and we'll take questions for Alan. Don't be shy.
Yes, hi.
Thank you. I happened to just read a Vanity Fair article about the creation of the Huffington Post. And so your comment about the need for media around this sector really resonates in thinking about getting people in the room who can make that happen and what happens if we do that. But I don't know who those people are. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that in thinking about that need for media focused on the sector.
Well, I think it's essential. I really do. I think the media so much governs our discourse. I mean, you know, the reason we have a First Amendment is so that our democracy can work, and, you know, for bad or good. I mean, look, I'm thrilled by these pictures of people in Egypt who are protesting and going into the streets. And, you know, thank God there's a media that can share that news, and they can also use Facebook and Twitter and social networking to get the message out, even when the government tries to shut it down. But then there's also other times when I think the media is irresponsible and doesn't act like big citizens. Again, part of the reason I wrote this book was to say, you know, we're each a big citizen. We can be. It's how we choose. Like, for example, when there was that crazy minister, remember, who threatened to burn the Koran when, you know, they were proposing the mosque here on Ground Zero. Now, that guy had 50 followers. I mean, you know, any of us could get 50 people in a room. But he got on national television, global, he created a global scandal to the point where the President of the United States really had to beg him, don't do that. You know, and people made decisions to make this guy a global figure. Why give him that kind of attention? He really didn't have that much power. He got that from the media because he you know, said he'd do a crazy thing. So, again, I think people have to decide. One of the things I love about Ariana is she put her money where her mouth